as Jean Marie had mentioned, so I'm Dr. Julie Spencer, so I'll go a little bit over who I am, but I just want to start today with the learning objectives. So today we're going to talk about the adolescent and young adult mind and brain, excuse me. So I will be kind of intertwining adolescent and young adults, so please know that when I speak of adolescents, I'm also speaking of young adult. It's a little bit of a mouthful when you say adolescent and young adult every single time. So, but please know that I am speaking of the same group. So some of the learning objectives. So after hearing this presentation, participants should be able to identify parts of the brain, note the trajectory of cognitive development in the adolescent brain, and be able to translate things learned about adolescent development into real-life practical situations. So a little bit about me. So I am, like Jean Marie mentioned, I'm the director of the Student Health and Wellness Center. I've been here now 2.5 years. So I was brought on to help build the Student Health and Wellness Center, and I'm also the physician. So I'm the on-site doctor. As far as our staff, we have a nurse practitioner who also sees patients for medical appointments. And then we also have our counseling director, Dr. Rachel Bersomley, and we have our 2 counselors, Janet and James. So we are, and also, our front office staff, our operations manager, Kat, who helps with insurance and scheduling and kind of is our gateway to all of us. Okay. Secondly, I'm a physician. My background is I'm double board certified in general pediatrics and adolescent and young adult medicine. So what this means is that I did my initial training, my residency in general pediatrics, realized that I love to work with teens and young adults, and then did an additional training of 3 years in specifically adolescent and young adult medicine. So I did this training at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and it was phenomenal. And I usually get the question, but why? Why teens? They're crazy. But as you guys know, you guys teach adolescents and young adults as well. So they're a great crowd to work with. So I'm a recent mother. I have a 7.5-month-old son who will, God willing, become an adolescent and drive me crazy one day. And I too was once an adolescent, as was all of you. So I know it's hard to look back and to reflect on our own experiences, but we've all been there. We've all been adolescents and young adults. We know what a tumultuous time it can be. So sometimes we have to remind ourselves. We get kind of caught up in the world of the adult brain, but sometimes it's good to remind ourselves that, hey, we were here once as well, okay? So what is adolescence? So adolescence is a period of life when a child develops into an adult. Pretty basic definition. The WHO, the World Health Organization, describes it as the period from puberty to maturity, terminating legally at the age of majority. Okay, so different countries has a different definition of that. Here it is 18. But we're actually seeing that age as far as legality. The age range, though, is being pushed back. Initially, it was 10 to 16, then it was 10 to 18, and I'm talking from a medical perspective. 10 to 21, now it's even being pushed back to 10 to 24. And the reason why is because a lot of students and young people are going away to college, but then they're coming back. So that growth of independence, yes, they're being independent in college, but they're noticing that now we're having all of these young people, because of the job market, because of other things, are actually coming back and delaying that adult process of being independent. So we're now noticing that clinicians, Children's Hospital Los Angeles, for example, we are now seeing, or we were when I was there, seeing patients up until 24. Specifically also, when a patient has a chronic illness, we noticed that those patients needed that extra time because they were always handheld and told, these are your medicines, this is what you do, these are your doctor's appointments. But all of a sudden, you end them at 18, you send them off to an adult physician who is not going to do that for you. So we kind of try to ease them a little bit better into that adult transition. So, however, it is a biopsychosocial process. It has a lot of factors, the biological factors, which we'll talk about, the psychological factors, and the social factors. So it is a growth period that has a lot of information coming from different angles. But it is not a continuous, uniform, synchronous process. It's not this smooth, lovely, arrow of growth. It's not even, a beautiful linear. It's up and then regression down. It's up, it's stepwise, it's asynchronous, and it can be messy. Okay, so we do know that. So I was very fortunate to have my education in adolescent and young adult health with what we call the grandfather of adolescent medicine, Dr. Richard McKenzie at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And he is my mentor. And the way that he describes adolescence is as the second birth. Okay, so the first birth, the baby, is your birth into existence. So the biggest kind of factors is everything is new, the physical, the holding, the walking, the crawling. It's all those physical factors of becoming, existing into a being. But adolescence is your second birth. You have the biological, the psychological, the social, the emotional, the media. You have all these different factors that then allow you to become a person in life. So I love his kind of analogy of adolescence as a second birth, of thinking about it kind of in a different mindset. So just to kind of a little bit of background. So physical, cognitive, emotional, and social kind of development. So as we talked about, adolescence can start usually around 10 years old and the onset of puberty. But now it's actually showing that it can start before that. The changes in the cognition and the emotional changes can start happening a little bit before that. So when you talk about physical, and this is stuff that obviously as a physician I pay attention to a great deal, but as an adolescent and young adult physician, I take into account the physical, the social, emotional, and the cognitive as well. And that's what really differentiates adolescent physicians from your general pediatrician that deals with adolescents. Is we have this knowledge of the background. I've spent many, many years focusing and learning on this part and how this can then affect the physical. So for physical, we have the initiation of puberty for the early years, which is 10 to 14, middle 15 to 17, late 18 and older. We used to have kind of an endpoint of 21, but we're now just generally saying just older. So initiation of puberty, completing puberty by the middle years, but now then reaching maturity for physical reproduction, okay? Cognitive, we're gonna talk a lot about these next two. Concrete thinking, increasing ability for abstract thinking, risk consequence deficits. Abstract reasoning understands risk and consequence. That's the general progression of the cognitive adolescent development. Emotionally, very egocentric in the early years. Middle years, developing sense of identity, risk-taking and experimentation, empathy and connectedness with others. Now, you notice any of these, and we'll speak about the social as well. You may have some students who may be 19 who are still in that early phase, okay? They're still in that emotional phase, that egocentric phase, and we'll talk about that as well. So like I said, it's not this beautiful linear, kind of progression. Somebody goes all of a sudden to developing sense of identity and they regress and they go back to egocentrism just because something has triggered them, okay? Social, reliance on family and parents, peer influence, differentiating from the family, explore new mature role in the family, social network, and workplace, and in their their school construct. But again, these are not linear. If anything, for social, we're seeing this, and then coming right back to reliance on family and parents. Yes?
Question. So you're talking about dominant behavior in each of these. Exactly. You're not talking about some falling off and then...
This is a generalization. So this is a generalization.
So and you're still a little bit of something, but exactly. You're more of something else.
So a general majority of adolescents will go through this very smoothly, with some, little regressions, some little hiccups. Again, try to remember back in your own adolescence, but the general majority will come out of this very stable, healthy adults, okay? But we have some, and those are the ones that we always remember. Those are the ones that are the difficult ones. Those are the ones that we are oh my gosh, how can I get through this student? That it's taking them a little bit longer, or they're going more of that stepwise progression. Yeah. Any questions on this? And then we will make the slides and the video available. So the brain, okay? So it's gonna get a little dry, so please bear with me. Please ask questions. I'll try to make it as kind of interactive as possible, but unfortunately neurobiology is as dry as it comes. Okay? So we have the lobes and the areas of the brain, okay? We have the cerebellum, which supports higher learning, math, music, advanced social skills. It's really, during this time, still under major development. Occipital lobe, which is our visual processing, it's pretty developed by this time in adolescence. Parietal lobe, still kind of under development. That's our processing, sensory input, language, analytical abilities. And we're going to talk about these a little bit more in depth. The temporal lobe is the hippocampus, which is our long-term memory, and the amygdala, the emotional center, and we'll speak about this more, and the frontal lobe. This is the last part of the brain to mature. They are now saying that studies are showing that the frontal lobe does not fully mature until actually 30 years old, okay? Which means that it's continuing. We're gonna go exactly through what the frontal lobe does, but essentially the executive functioning, and it is the conductor of the brain. It's the reasoning, it's the problem solving, it's the judgment, the impulse control, the emotions. Meaning that if studies are now showing that it's up to 30 years old, it's when it's actually fully matured. We have to give each other and ourselves and our students slack that, why aren't they getting this? It's kind of unfair if they're not even able, functionally, actually, physiologically able to do it, okay? Because if we're sitting there and saying able to be mature at 24 years, now 30 years, it's unfair to sit there and say, okay, it's like a baby. A baby crawls the first day, the next day you say, why aren't you walking? They're not there yet. Okay, at 6 months, they're not there yet. Yeah.
Is that age getting pushed farther and farther because of the way we're using technology and things? Is that changing?
So that's a lot of the research that's going on right now. And a lot of that is, and we'll talk about kind of what the frontal lobe and the attention and what that's doing because of the age of technology. Attention spans are decreasing. So take attention spans that are decreasing, and the area for attention doesn't, mature until later. You have this dichotomous relationship. So it is very, very interesting research that's coming out right now. Yes.
Are you also going to mention anything about how maybe some substance abuse, like chronic substance abuse, affects the development of the brain?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we'll talk about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But essentially, this is the brain. Yeah.
Can't it also be argued, though, that the development stages of the brain don't necessarily mean that they're incapable of doing things? It's just a period of growth for the brain. So it's when the brain is actually making connections. So it's optimal time to learn.
Exactly. And we'll talk about that as well, that it is optimal time to learn. However, the brain is very plastic, and that's what they're saying. So because of this plasticity, adolescence is actually the best time to pick up a new language, to pick up an instrument, to be in school and to learn new things. But you'll see that there are other things that are kind of not allowing that process to happen or kind of bombarding that process. That the synapses, and we'll talk about the kind of, being able and that growth potential is there, but other things are kind of blocking it, okay? But yes, absolutely, this is the time for growth. Exactly, so we'll talk a little bit about that. So just kind of going back to the, early stages, this is the neurons, the neural growth. And the neurons are essentially our freeways for information, okay? It's how we get information across different areas of the brain. So if you go back, what you see in the visual process has to be, this information has to then be sent to the frontal lobe, and that's done by neurons, okay? So at birth, we have a few neurons, 3 months, 15 months. It is just constant growth, okay? Then in adolescence, that second burst, right? the synapses undergo a huge more growth. So not only is it just growth of synapses, it's the connections though now of the synapses, okay? So exactly around what they were doing around those 15 months, 18 months. So they go through a period of extreme growth, a little bit of stopped growth, and then extreme growth again during adolescence. But most of this growth is in the temporal and parietal lobes, okay? So in the emotional centers, the numbers processing, sensory input, language, analytical abilities, not your CEO of the brain, okay? That's what the frontal lobe is really called, the CEO, the executive functioning of that. So when we think about learning, and this is to get really cellular, when we think about learning, what causes learning is something called long-term potentiation, okay? I'm not going to talk about the neurotransmitters, but essentially what it means is the repeated stimulation of the neurons and the synapses is what causes memories and learning to happen, okay? So initial state, a little bit of the synapses kind of sending out neurotransmitters. In a week, with repeated stimulation, there's now more neurotransmitters. There's now more stimulation. There's now more learning and memory grabbing those things. This all happens during childhood and more in adolescence. So things like learning in classroom, memory, music, musical instruments, languages, this is all due to the long-term potentiation. So the first stage in cognitive brain kind of molding in adolescence is something that is called synaptic pruning. So we talked about that at birth, it's very few synapses, then it goes to a great deal, and then continues where at 7 years, they have all these synapses and all these connections. What is going on in the brain is starting to kind of weed out, okay? The pruning, we're weeding out the things that we don't use, okay? We don't need to use how to initially hold a spoon. We know that already. It's learned already. We don't need to know that part of the brain, what it's like, what grass smells like for the first time. We have that down, okay? So we're pruning all of that stuff away. A researcher by the name of Jay Geed has this principle of use it or lose it, and that's what the synaptic process is happening, and the pruning is happening. It's pruning away excess connections that are not being used, so essentially making a more refined adult brain, okay? So you're taking away all of those processes, those early processes in the back that were first, because we're learning and we're growing developmentally from the back to the front. It's getting rid of all of that kind of cobweb so that we can be able to use the synapses that we need to and be able to redefine them.
So with that philosophy, let's say, okay, now you don't need to smell freshly mown grass, but if all of a sudden, even once you were an adult, then you're back in a setting, wouldn't the brain stimulate and relearn that? I mean,
but it's a memory. It's a memory already from a long-term potential.
It's a memory.
It's not an original synapse. So if
even
you
when
go back to
cleaning, it's keeping some little piece.
exactly. So it's that using or losing it. That using of I know what grass smells like. But that first initial learning of my brain learning of what grass, how to kind of identify grass, I don't need that anymore because it's now a memory. I've learned that. So we're getting rid of all of those cobwebs. And that's all coming through during adolescence, okay? So the kind of example that he used is with Michelangelo's David, a huge slab of marble, which is then chipped away to then develop the actual sculpture. And that's the kind of metaphor that he liked to use during this time of synaptic pruning. You're pruning away all of those things that you don't need to then have the end product. So the second stage is something called myelination. So myelination, if the neuron is our freeway, myelination is the express lane on the 110, okay? You have to pay for it, but it's what enables the brain and the neurons to operate more efficiently, okay? That's what myelination. So during this process of adolescence and the development of the brain, myelination is not done. It is not done. And studies show that it doesn't get finished until 20 years old or so, the actual myelination. Having those neurons, those connections to be working functionally correctly, it's not that kind of what we call encapsment, it's not done yet, okay? So they have those connections, but they're not being used as efficiently as they can be as in a full adult brain, okay? So this process of myelination starts from the parietal and temporal lobes and then moves to the front. So this is the actual idea, and not idea, excuse me, the actual process of going from concrete to abstract thinking, that myelination, okay? And even just the idea of myelination without actually, because we're not neurobiologists, to me is very abstract, okay? So, but it's that transition from that concrete to that abstract thinking. So this is a nice kind of visualization of the red and the yellow are areas that are, excuse me, are neuron bodies without the myelination. And then the blue is when it's all myelinated, the blue and the purple. So it's just showing the progression of the myelination of the neurons in the brain. That these are actual brain scans, what's going on in the brain during those time periods, okay? So what does this kind of look like? So the ways of thinking and learning, you know, when we think of concrete learning, a good example is taking a toddler, a child to the zoo. You're using their senses, that concrete thinking. You see the elephant, you smell the hay, you are visualizing the color of the elephant. It's very concrete ideas, okay? Then the next stage is you go home and you have that child read books and see pictures. It's not something that's tangible right in front of them, but they can translate what I saw. Oh, it's the same thing as what I'm reading in this book, okay? But then the abstract thinking is you can have an abstract bunny. I didn't see a bunny ever at the zoo or read in the books looking like this, but in my abstract thinking, this bunny can be anything I want it to be, okay? So it's that idea of the concrete to the abstract thinking, okay? Where something is tangible, the child at the zoo seeing things in real life to, well, what does that mean to me? What is my thought of that, you know, elephant or that bunny, okay? Any questions on that?
So what does that mean for like somebody in their 20s? What does, like our students, what does that mean, that movement from concrete to abstract at that age?
Mm-hmm. At that age, so I mean, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that means that the process, especially, you know, and because it's not linear, and some people may be stuck in this process or stuck in that process a little bit, that sometimes being told, think abstractly, they're sitting there going, but I'm still at the zoo. I'm still having to focus on the tangible things of what I smell and what I hear. I can't tell you what it looks like yet. I'm not there yet. Okay? So it's an abstract answer to an abstract.
No, that totally makes
Yeah. Okay. So next is the prefrontal lobes. All right. And this is part of the frontal lobes. This is the last area of the brain to develop. This is from the back to the front. All right. The prefrontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex, this is what is responsible for the CEO. It's responsible for reasoning ability, goal and priority setting, planning and organizing multiple tasks, impulse inhibition, determining cause and effect relationships, determining right from wrong, the ability to make good judgments, and emotional control. So just to reflect on it, that's the last thing that is developed in our brain, right? So we're inundated with all of these stimuli and emotions and temporal relationships, but we can't reason it out just yet. Or maybe we can a little bit, but I can't organize what I'm going to do with that with that information. I'm still trying to figure out what's right and wrong, okay? So these are all the prefrontal cortex. So if you think, and we'll go a little bit more in depth of that, about the emotional control, is things that are developed in the prefrontal cortex, if you're still in that kind of previous stage, these things are very difficult. So adolescents and young adult, what is the number one thing that is very hard for them to do? Multitask. At least I see in students. Multitasking.
Can I ask Dr. Spencer too, just looking at that list, would some other possible classroom manifestations be forgetting things
Yep.
and an inability to follow directions?
Yep.
Are those part of these?
Yes, absolutely. So the planning, the organizing, determining the cause and effect. So being told, okay, I have to follow these directions, goal and prioritizing setting, reasoning ability, that's still underdeveloped. I'm given these directions. Sometimes it's hard for them to translate into, okay, this is what I need to do, okay? So these are the whole ideas of what's going on in the frontal cortex and trying to decipher where a student is because, you know, you assume, oh, you're 20 years old. You got it all figured out. Now you got to figure out, okay, do they understand planning or organizing? Do they understand what's between right and wrong? So it can be extremely difficult for educators because you're trying to decipher not only where they are developmentally as a whole generalization, you know, and in general, but how they are individually. So it's extremely difficult, okay? But something like multitasking, it takes away attention. When they're told, okay, an example, give me an example of multitasking, because I'll give a very
Listening to
medical.
music and doing an assignment.
Okay, all right, so is that something that you would assign them? Say,
No, but it's something they do.
they do.
when told
Okay.
not to.
Exactly. Okay. So that's divided their attention. Whereas in an adult, that music can be background noise. Okay. But the music, that kind of, because it's also stirring emotion, can then divide their attention into, okay, I have to focus on what I'm doing here, but I love this song. I used to listen to this song with my boyfriend, and it is stirring up all these emotions. Oh, but wait, I have to get back here. That's a great example, because that's tying into the emotional component of
Do you think though that sometimes when you look at what else is going on, so if they have worse distractions going on and now they're like, I'm just gonna put on this, you know, meditation music and try to, it's still causing all these things that you're saying, but if there's like people fighting around
it?
that,
Oh, yeah,
or
absolutely.
there's all sorts of things going on, maybe that's allowing them to focus better.
Oh, I understand. So saying music is a better option in the background rather than people fighting, those kind of things?
Yeah, if they have worse distractions going on, they're like, okay, I'm gonna pick.
So, and that's a really interesting concept, and it's an interesting thought, kind of, you know, picking the worst, you know, what's the worst evil, kind of, you know, what to do, and that's interesting. And that to me, because, and we'll talk about the emotional control and how kind of that the emotional part of their brain is developed so kind of earlier, rather before all of this stuff, that stimuli, it's to me, what would kind of allow a less emotional response to draw that attention away? Do you understand what I'm saying? So we'll kind of talk about that, specifically about the emotional control. You know, when we hear about adolescents and young adults, the impulsivity, right? They don't have that, you know, the whole, you know, invincibility, right? It's not developed. We hear about, that's kind of your cliche adolescents. They, you know, they can do, it's never going to happen to them. They can do everything, right? It's because this area of the brain has not developed yet, okay? Determining right from wrong when they're starting.
Can we just distinguish the difference between completely developed and not being developed at all? Because I think that's kind of misleading to think that they have like a completely undeveloped prefrontal cortex when actually many of them are actually older students too. And so knowing that at 24, it'll be completely developed. So this is actually an opportunity to help them develop in all these areas, something that they're just learning to work through.
Exactly. And so, but with all of this, stating that the mind of an adolescent and a young adult is very plastic. So exactly what you're saying, it can be easily molded. However, they don't live in a bubble, okay? They don't just live in the classroom of where we're teaching them. They have so many outside influences, you know, technology in itself. So being able to navigate away from all of those kind of negative or other things that are kind of drawing their attention and their learning, being able to focus that, okay? So absolutely, it's not as, okay, one day you're this and one day you're this. It's a, you know, it's a continuum, but with lots of kind of growth in between there. However, the students and, adolescents and young adults can sometimes, because they're still trying to work all of this out, it's hard for them to understand the gray areas, that abstract thinking. It's very black and white. So this may look to you as you may say something, a direction or an action, and they may question you on it because they don't understand the abstract and that kind of emotional, okay, I'm hearing this immediately. That's not what I'm thinking. You say black, I think white. They're not thinking that gray way yet. So that's how they may interact with you, as they may question things.
I wish they would question.
Oh, okay.
They just sort of nod and they don't have no idea what just washed over them. But yeah.
So that is an opportunity. Put it back out on them. Ask them. Question me. Because if you're there sitting there, that's a really good point. If they're sitting there and you're saying white, they're thinking black. That blank stare, it's not there. So they may not question it, and that's great. But sitting there and saying, question me. Is this what you're thinking? Tell me. Is that the way that you would think about it too? Or do you think about it in a different way? Bring that out in them, okay? So, and we'll talk about ways, but we talk about some practical implications. Spur debate. Have them to start thinking in different ways. You're helping build and mold that brain, okay? So when you're just sitting there and lecturing, you're saying, well, the sky is blue, the sky is blue, the sky is blue. And they're sitting and going, I don't think it's blue, I don't think it's blue. All you're doing is just repeating. Instead of, well, why don't you think it's blue? Let's talk about it. Let's discuss that. And I know I'm picking terrible examples, so I apologize, but it is very interesting if it's just kind of a wash over, but to think, well, but what are they thinking? You know, is it because I'm completely on a different page and they don't even know where to begin? So let's talk about it. Let's debate it.
Also, there's one other factor that we deal with a lot in fashion, especially. We have a lot of Asian students, and their language skills are very poor. And so I don't often know if they don't understand the concept or they just plain didn't understand what I said.
And I don't talk at all about that. Okay, that could be just a whole another topic, cultural, we're just getting down to the nitty gritty of the neurobiology, but the cultural differences, the language differences, I mean, it's all encompassing, but that is a great point.
And that might be another expert speaker series.
Right, on how, but, for the kind of basic neurobiology, I mean, it's invaluable to think of how one's cultural experiences kind of melds and kind of helps us understand this. So I want to talk specifically about emotional control because we get this a lot with students. But the emotional control is housed in the amygdala. It's the emotional center of the brain. And if we remember, the amygdala is back here. So it's getting processed and it's getting grown and developed much sooner than the executive functioning. Okay, so what that means and what that looks like, it's the amygdala, its job is to process sensory information. You have a stimuli, it processes it, it then, in theory, should go to the front of the mind to process it, to then sit there and say, is this the correct way I should be responding? What do I think about this stimuli? And then you have a response. With adolescents, that is not there yet. It's not there yet. So you're going to have adolescents who will be more emotional to things that when they are stimulated. Exactly. So you'll see, and again, we are speaking with the younger adolescents than the older adolescents, but we see the student, you tell them a critique. Boom, it's the floor has just fallen out from under them. Okay? They don't have that idea of being able to process that stimuli. Okay? So emotions dictate the behavior instead of logical thought process. Okay, and we see that every day. I mean, we get students brought to our center all the time. So cognitive development in adolescence just overall. So kind of just getting it down to what goes on. They develop more advanced reasoning skills. They have the ability to think more abstractly, but they are also thinking about thinking. That they call it, how do they call it? The mega-centric, I apologize for going out, but the thinking about thinking, and what that is what now that I'm learning that whole thing. I'm getting that stimuli. I'm learning to think and kind of reflect on that. But I'm also thinking, what are others thinking? Okay? Because that's coming in part of it too. The peer influence is also coming into it. What are they thinking? Are they thinking differently than I'm thinking? It's that egocentrism. There's also this thought of, I'm losing the words and I apologize. Mommy brain is very, very, very real. So I do apologize. But the empathy of others, of, you know, that's part also of the frontal cortex, of being able to decipher right and wrong, decipher and have those empathetic feelings. And so when you're thinking about the thinking, they're also trying to figure out, how do I kind of generalize this to everybody else, you know, but also thinking in the egocentric.
Yeah.
Because some people can be still stuck in that early adolescent stage of egocentric, of everything is happening to them. This has never happened to anybody else but me. We've heard that. Nobody else has had this feeling but me. Adolescents, especially early adolescents, deal with that it's a real struggle for them, very real struggle. And that's that egocentrism. So some practical applications. So I found this kind of research about fostering well-being, and I love this quote, and this is from a book called Innovative Skills to Support Well-Being and Resiliency in Youth. And I know Dr. Rachel Rosamley has done a faculty workshop on resiliency, so that kind of a little bit ties into that. But this is
on the TLC website.
This is the idea of well-being, is to refocus, because this book talks not only to educators but also to clinicians, to refocus our ideas of what to do to support and promote healthy development, as opposed to the focus on the youth deficits and ways to correct unhealthy behavior. So instead of saying, you're doing this, 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 and this is what's wrong, this is the deficit, instead, how do we support and promote the healthy parts of development instead of focusing on those negatives always? I really, really like that idea. So the fostering and well-being kind of goes on to this idea by Richard Lerner, and his idea is positive youth development, and he has developed these 6 C's. So they're confident, there's character, there's connection, interpersonal connection, competent, caring, again, and contribution. So the 6 C's of positive youth development, what this means is, while adolescents and young adults are going through development, they're becoming confident in their skills. They're becoming confident in what can they do. This is, for clinicians and educators, let's focus on these of, you know, and I know you had talked about instead of saying this, it goes with the resiliency, that handout, saying this, you know, instead of saying you're doing this wrong, great, you're doing this right. Let's build on that, okay?
Focus on that process.
Exactly, on that process. Character, adolescents and young adults are going through this stage and building their individualism, what it means to be them. So building that character, focusing on that. You're going through that whole, you know, egocentric them, but then how they're kind of experiencing life and then connection with others, okay? Competence, as with anybody, we want to be competent adults. We want to know what we know, okay? So focusing on that competence and how to kind of ease them through that phase so that they feel comfortable and confident in what they know. But then caring about, not only caring about myself, but also reinforcing self-care, because I know adolescents and young adults are very poor in reinforcing self-care, but also caring for others, okay? And then contribution. We want adults, we want students, when they come out of, you know, university, higher education, to be able to contribute to the general population, okay? So it's by Richard Lerner. He comes out of Tufts University, excuse me. But this book really, really delves into those 6 C's. So they take his concept and really, really delve into the well-being. It's a very, very interesting book. So take advantage. Take advantage of what adolescents are going through. Spur debates, exactly what we were talking about. Spur debates. Let the student use emotion to enhance their learning. obviously, to an extent. We don't want them to be blurting out and being very emotional, but to an extent. And as artists, emotion drives their artistic ability. Have them use that emotion instead of trying to be, make it so analytical. Have them use that.
Well, and I can see that, and I'm sorry, speaking from my background in English, because we talk a lot in our classes about this concept of rhetoric, and that's one of the things we've been bringing more into the assignments, our writing assignments, is saying, okay, what is your emotional connection to what you're talking about? Add that as a layer to the assignment, and we tend to get the students a little bit more engaged, because I think it's a little bit too of that little bit of egocentric, I can't say it.
Centricity, yeah.
Thank you.
Definitely.
But I think for me, that's how I'm interpreting what you're saying with this emotion.
Absolutely.
I do a little kind of play on that too. Right before the midterm exam, I know I walk in the room and they're all, right? So the first thing I do is I make everybody do some stretches or breathing or jumping jacks for 5 minutes just to get that energy. And then I point out to them how far they've come this quarter before we even take the test. I know we've been giving you feedback and critique all, right? But you came in not knowing the software, and now you're all drawing button-down shirts and blazers. Like, can we be proud of ourselves for a minute?
See that confidence. You're building that confidence.
And I get everyone to agree that, yeah, they've learned a lot so far. And then I tell them that's because I'm such a great teacher. That's exactly what that happens. And they laugh, and the tenseness goes away. Exactly. And then I say, great, now I know you're all going to do great on this midterm because I taught you everything you need to know. So have fun. And I try to lighten it up. Honestly, I don't know if it makes a difference or not, but I'm hoping it certainly doesn't hurt, if nothing else.
Exactly.
So
instead of just, here's your midterm, do your thing,
right.
Just kind of bringing it back a little bit. And reinforcing, exactly. I love that you reinforce, look at how much you've come, how far you've come, to sit there and so they even reflect, wow, I have grown. Instead of kind of just that, this is the way I have to think, this is this and this, you're reflecting back on that and you're bringing that emotional and that confidence and that confidence back in there. I really like that. So simplifying tasks and requests, we can simplify until we turn blue in the face, but it doesn't necessarily change things, but it is one way, according to the neurobiologists and these people to do that. But exposing students to a variety of experiences and activities. Exactly. Even in your example, just a different experience, a different way to think about it. But exposing them to these different experiences and activities helps build that learning, helps build those, synapses. And they're starting to get rid of all of that kind of cobwebby stuff out there. And they're learning from each of these things.
It also really helps them to develop more ability to focus, because the newness lets them get through this threshold of interest and keeps them going longer. So I see the more we create variety for them, the more they'll dive in and literally fall into paying attention.
Exactly. But at the same time, focusing on one task at a time, because of that multitasking function is not necessarily there. But add on, somebody had asked about technology and the fact that attention span is getting so low for adults, not just adolescents, that focusing on one task at a time is extremely important. And just kind of on a side note, there was just an article in the Journal of American Medicine, or JAMA, that multitasking for physicians is actually quite dangerous. Yeah. That as much as physicians are told you need to multitask, you need to write your notes and be able to do this and think of this, something is going to fall by the wayside. And so it's a very, very interesting article, because as physicians, we're always taught, you have to be able to juggle things. Think of surgeons, they're doing this, this, and this, and sometimes that multitasking can be dangerous. It's a very
also read it's a fallacy too, that you can't actually multitask.
Exactly.
And so you're constantly just shifting your attention, doing different tasks quickly.
Exactly.
And I think it's not just the lowering of attention. I think we encounter this in our classrooms. There's so much stimulus constantly because of the fact they have their devices with them 24/7. There's this ubiquitous content everywhere, that they're also just their ability to process all this stimulus. And I think I'm kind of taking this away from you, that yeah, it's a lot of stimulus for me. I can only imagine at their age when their brains are still developing and they don't have the higher cognitive function to be able to process. And it kind of speaks to me why they struggle in being able to understand what's key information, what's good information, what information I need to complete a task, because it's just everywhere. They're surrounded by information.
Exactly. And they're still developing that knowledge, those synapses to be able to decipher what they need. Exactly. So, in medicine, and when I was sitting there and I was talking to Jean Marie about kind of, practical implications for this, I was kind of wanting to see if something that we do in medicine, it's kind of going a little bit out of favor, but something that we learn in medicine could possibly translate to, in the art world and in teaching. So in medicine, it's very kind of this idea of see one, do one, teach one. Okay, and it kind of goes along with this Aristotle quote that for things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. Very abstract, but that see one, do one, teach one kind of idea. And I don't know if this is
absolutely part of.
Okay, perfect, absolutely, and that's great, and that's wonderful. So it translates. So I'm very, very thankful for that, because in medicine, I noticed that, and that's the way that we learn, and that's the way that it's kind of inundated to us, is that you see how a procedure, any procedure, a blood draw is done. I'm going to be easy. I'm not going to talk about spinal taps and all that stuff, but you see how a blood draw is done. You then do that. You then, once you mastered that doing, you then teach that. And that teaching that is ultimately that turn that you have then become the actual learner, because you've learned it, because now you can pass on that information. So if that can translate, that's fantastic.
Well, and that's something I was talking to Dr. Spencer just in my own interactions with faculty here and at other art and design schools, like absolutely that concept of see one with the demo, do one, follow the demo. And then when I talk to faculty, that third step, the teaching, that's, I think, where, like, how then do the students teach each other? And that's the part I see of, maybe that's the third thing we're missing, is the having our students teach each other.
Because being able to teach, because when you're doing it yourself, you're taking in everything that you're learning. You're taking in everything that you're seeing. I know, okay, I have to do this. I have to do that's okay. The person, put the tourniquet on. They looked for the vein. They felt for the thing. They did this. They did that. But for then me to be able to tell somebody else and to teach that, I have to fully understand that. If I miss a part, if I don't understand a part, I'm not going to be able to successfully teach it, and that person's not going to be able to learn it. So it's a great, and it's in the sense of going out of favor in medicine. It started in actually a surgical kind of setting. That in surgery, it's very, exact and precise. That you stand there, you see, your hierarchical surgeon doing a procedure. You see it, you then take that in, you do it yourself, and then now you are then that professor. You are then that teaching. So it's a very kind of surgical cut and dry idea, but it's translated to all the other aspects in medicine. But I still do it now.
I actually think it, like, especially with like the Kale classes and some of those classes, that the students end up, they may have a chance because they're interacting with some other organization to teach something. So they have learned some of their skills, like in my Kale class, they then teach some of their own skills to kids that are younger than them. So they have that chance. So it's interesting to think that, okay, that's a good loop.
Exactly, and I'd be very interested to hear back from your students do you now feel that now that you've taught that, do you feel that you have a mastery of it? And we're like, well, yeah, because I have to teach it.
Sometimes we get this in critique, and particularly if we're speaking to the metacognition of getting a strategy. For instance, how I started this drawing of comparative measurements. If the student now is explaining what they used first, and they're doing a presentation in front of the class, then the students that aren't capable of having this kind of self-talk strategy are actually hearing the student that does have a handle on it. And so I think that presentations and different group activities that happen a lot in our classes make a huge difference in this.
Exactly. And you know, students hear a group project, they're like, oh, you know, but then you sit there and they actually, you know, they actually get into it. And if you kind of just think kind of this basic concept, I mean, it's pretty basic concept, you know, see one, do one, teach one.
Well, we live it.
Exactly, as teachers, exactly. And so to translate it to students, have students do exactly that, you know. So I mean, I love it, and I love that you guys are doing it. I love that it's, you know, multifaceted, that it's not just our little, you know, because my biggest thing, and I'll get to sleep, is that the reason why I love working here as a physician is it's completely different. I've never been exposed to an art community, you know, medicine, and I actually did a little research on the difference of an artist's brain. It's so fascinating, and I love that I can talk and say, well, something that, you know, is ingrained, same with doing teaching, it's being done in the art world. And so I just love that, learning the differences, but also learning the similarities between something as different as medicine and art, but there actually is an art of medicine. Yes. So, you know, but I have to put the plug, and it's not my baby. Sleep. All of this stuff happens. All of those synapses, all of those grooves in the brain, all of it is developing during sleep. All of it.
Well, they get plenty during my class.
Exactly. So, but just a reminder that students, you know, and going through, you know, also what Rachel was talking about, the mindfulness, the here and now, let's use that, because students are thinking right at that moment. It's very hard for adolescents and young adults to picture what they're going to be doing in 5 years. It's very, very hard. Bring them back to the here and now. It's you know, it's hard for some of us, obviously, you know, but imagine for adolescents and young adults that don't have that executive functioning ability yet. Bring that back to the here and now.
Well, it's really kind of one of my, like, what I'm starting to develop in my takeaway. I don't know if this is anyone else's takeaway, but it's really showing me that as a faculty, I'm not just responsible for my content, I'm also responsible for mentoring them through this growth and development. So I shouldn't be, like, if I'm frustrated because they're not following through on these higher cognitive functions, it's not because they don't want to, it's because I need to do a better job supporting them to develop those functions. And so it's just kind of a different perspective. It doesn't change the demand or the need, but it just approaches how I go into the classroom with a little more understanding of the student. I don't know if anyone else is having that kind of reaction too, but.
Actually, I feel like we are teaching our curriculum, but particularly in foundation, our responsibility in studios is to teach them more about how to learn and how to think through things. And if I look at that and you start looking at your CLOs and PLOs, you can trace exactly this material. And I think that the more faculty feel supportive of that and recognize that, the more we can out it. And that's what we're trying to do, is expose, okay, this is a metacognitive function. Now you are thinking about this. And research shows that then once they understand that, it's actually helping to stimulate this exact growth in their
So
brain.
you're myelinating.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, they are.
We're trying.
You're exactly myelinating those neurons.
Tell me
You know, you're doing
Start using myelination.
Myelination, right? So, and this is just in my own research for this topic. What I did find, this was a study that was actually published, and it's called Neuroimaging Journal, which of course all of us have access to. But it was written in 2014, and they actually did studies on art students versus non-art students, and where they were actually doing imaging of the brain to kind of find out, is the artist brain different? So what they found is that more neural matter in areas responsible for visual imaging and fine motor they lit up more in an artist's brain versus then a non-artist brain. And particularly if an artist was better at drawing, they had more gray matter in the area and in the section of the parietal lobe, which was more for fine motor movements. This region linked to creativity and the ability to manipulate, combine, and deconstruct visual images. But it was very interesting because it kind of debunked the theory of the right brain and the left brain, because it showed that it was all over, okay? So that whole idea, you know, and it's in a day that, you know, analytic thought, it's your left brain, and the art and the creativity is your right brain, but it kind of debunks that theory, okay?
Which, that makes more sense, because to me, you would be thinking critically when you're busy creating.
Exactly. But then it also begs the question, is this a nurture versus nature? Are they art students because of this, or because of this, are they art students?
A little bit of both, right?
Right?
And
So it
we
kind
have
of
a lot of
opens that
students who
discussion.
don't have this coming in.
Mhm.
They absolutely don't have more gray matter. and what I'm trying to see is what my interest is. Okay, so now through the training, at what point does this begin to develop the new?
The new. So, I mean, in that one picture, if I can go back to it, of the change of the brain, the red and orange to all of a sudden the blue and the purple, that's that, you know, that myelination, that changing, yes, that changing, you know. But so it's interesting if they do this and then take an artist's brain and then kind of see the imaging, that would be extremely interesting research. So I think I should get an MRI machine and I should do all this, right? Start a foundation and then at the end, but be very, very interesting, because this is just general population, but then kind of narrow it down to an art student versus a non-art student. I think it was just really fascinating because I wanted to see, is there data out there? But it really, and it kind of goes away, that whole
Well, we actually teach our students that they can develop new neural pathways. And so we try to talk about it as though if you understand that could happen, then in fact you open yourself up to learn that, to learn more.
And on that, because doesn't the brain still remain somewhat plastic even after 24?
Yeah, exactly. So it does. And you know, there are some, we're constantly learning, but the kind of general kind of foundation and, you know, the, what am I trying to say? The connections are there, you know, the scaffolding, excuse me, that's what I'm saying. The scaffolding and the different connections by the time 24, 30, that's all there. But those little kind of, you know, extra things are being, you know, grown. Yes,
The whole idea
absolutely.
you can't teach full dopamine tricks, how that's been disproven.
Exactly.
You know, it just is more difficult to learn after a certain point.
Exactly.
It moves more
Exactly.
slowly. The plasticity is slower.
Right.
Exactly.
So that's what
and
really
then the brain is then
optimal
changing, you know, because then as we age, you know, those synapses, those connections, myelination is starting to get a little, you know, a little old in the joints a little bit, you know, and so that kind of new ability is going away. Exactly.
I think there's two things really involved in the whole old dog new tricks things. Besides the physical, there's also the emotional component. Is I expect to learn things quickly now, and we forget how long it took us to learn to walk or to ride a bike. And I'm constantly pointing that out to the students that they get mad that they can't use this right away. I'm like, well, how long did it take you to learn to use a sewing machine? Oh, I guess it took a while. But you were how old? 10, so you didn't mind.
But then
So
there's
I'm
also that
constantly-
expectation that you may
Right.
have, because we forget, you know, we
Right.
forget, and sitting there and saying that, you know, my son just started crawling. If I would sit there and be like, oh, well, he's not walking yet, though. You know, no, I'm going to give him time, you know, to be able to develop that, you know. I know that it's going to take time, but there's also in my research the studies that show that, you know, it used to be this thought that just childhood, those first 6 years were so important in learning and music and, you know, the baby Einstein and all that stuff, you know, and flashcards, that's ongoing. It's not just in that certain period, but it's that first birth and now that second birth. Not to be cliche.
I teach at 12:30, so I have to
Yeah,
go in a few
please.
minutes. But if this is okay to ask you a question now. So obviously there's a lot of behavioral things that are additional layers to everything that you're teaching about. But specifically to go back to the brain, you know how as teachers and instructors, we always hear that you want to have like a multisensory kind of teaching technique where they see things visually. They're also going through a hands-on kind of experience. They're listening to something, and you know, like by the time we've exposed them to all these different ways of teaching the subject, they're more likely to kind of remember everything. But that's all, I mean, all I know is that that's kind of a theory that's out there, and I'm sure I've seen it work, but how does that relate to the brain?
Well, it relates
that
because in
sense.
the beginning that concrete thinking, right? Those senses, those 5 initial senses, but then translating and using those experiences, being able to, well, this is how I felt when I smelled that hay at the zoo. You know, taking those concrete instances and then dealing with and bringing it to an abstract thought. Okay, so that's how the brain functions, is taking all of those, you know, like I said, the example of the baby or the toddler going to the zoo and using those exact senses. And then they go back home and they read a book. They're not in front of an elephant, but they remember that elephant from the zoo, that tangible thing. So then when they develop that abstract thinking, well, in my mind, an elephant is pink. An elephant is doing this. It's that building on itself, those senses, that concrete thinking. You have to have that good foundation to then be able to do that abstract thing.
Well, and I would jump into this concept of the multimodality of teaching. I think it's also
Instead of just lecturing.
well, it's also, I think, to keep them attentive. I think it has to do with that attention, because every time you switch an activity, the brain has to switch with you. And so I think it's kind of that, okay, now I got to wake up. Like I might have been asleep for your 15 minutes, but oh shoot, now I'm in group discussion. I got to wake up, right? So it's like, I think that's also part of it, is to keep that attention.
That activities and those experiences, which the practical implication of it, that's what you do.
They've kind of found that everyone's multi-learners. Like everyone will appreciate different learning styles. That we are not dominant in any one. We all benefit from multiple styles.
And even just, you know, from speaking of what I can speak of, medical schools, the way that they're teaching is very different. When I went to medical school, you know, in the snow twice, you know, up and down both ways. But exactly. Yeah. That's how I feel like when I say that. But it was very, you know, you have your physiology, you have your pathology, you have your pharmacology, you have your anatomy, and then in anatomy, you're learning everything. Now, the way that they're doing it is the brain. You're learning the anatomy, the physiology of the brain. You're learning the pharmacology of the brain. You're learning not just, you know, the anatomy, you're connecting it together. So I know, based on the anatomy and the physiology, how this pharmacological agent is now going to work. And doing it that way. So it's now based on systems instead of kind of your old school way of thinking, which I think is super fascinating. I wish
that's great, and can be applied here as well.
Exactly.
I mean, it's something I'm noticing in the fashion department in trying to bridge the digital classes, because it's always been digital fashion. And I've been working really hard lately to bridge the two and bring hand drawing into my digital classes, which is unheard of. But I'm getting much better results that way, and then trying to bring the digital back to the illustration classes.
And then we're all faced against technology, because it's, you know, and just the constant influx of information, the constant influx. I mean, for us, you know, our attention spans. I've seen a patient, and all of a sudden my phone is going off. I'm thinking, oh God, is it the nanny? Is it the baby? You know, and this and that. And so, but yes, so thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Of course. I hope it wasn't too abstract.
No, it was great.
Thank you.